Often described as how not to do a merger, the Pennsylvania Railroad's merger into the Penn Central system, which included the New York Central as well as the New Haven Railroad, amongst other properties which the Pennsylvania Railroad already owned, remains the most infamous merger of northeastern railroads of its time. The Pennsylvania Railroad was long considered the Google of its day, if you will, being the most successful company in the United States. The company was in its prime in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when expansion seemed to come after expansion. No idea or plan was off the table, as the company had that much in terms of economic power, with an operating budget during this period in time that was rivaled only by that of the United States government. This made potentially expensive expansion plans, such as building directly into New York City via the underground tunnels and building a grand station in the middle of the city, as well as building in the opposite direction toward Washington, D.C., despite all the legal and financial challenges this plan would also require, and electrifying such a line, as well as the takeover of smaller businesses along the way to make it all possible. No issue at all in terms of financing for the company to pull off. Despite this territory being a long-held stronghold of America's oldest railroad, the B&O. Please feel free to take a look at my video on this subject, as it's a very interesting topic as how the Pennsylvania Railroad managed to defeat the B&O, despite the legal and financial hurdles this required. For the longest time, the Pennsylvania Railroad, or Pennsy as it was known for short, seemed to be unstoppable. However, this wouldn't last. After World War II and the prosperity of the 50s into the 60s, most railroads in the United States would find themselves dealing with unprecedented changes, with passenger service slowly but surely being lost to the automobile, as well as buses and planes, as well as sharp increases in expenses due to inflation, as well as new expenses being incurred due to higher wages being required of employees and more limited hours than employees could work per day, would bring the seemingly limitless good fortune of the Pennsylvania Railroad to an abrupt halt just after World War II, when it made its first loss ever. As, while not its major revenue source, a good portion of the Pennsylvania's profits came from its passenger services. This would set up a long period of decline for the railroad, which it seemingly couldn't get itself out of. One of the main reasons one could give for this is the fact that the company never had to deal with anything like this in its history. It always had enough profits that even if it lost money on certain investments and or railroad lines, etc., there was always more than enough money to cover these losses and still keep the company profitable. Now everything was losing money at once, and the company needed to make a dramatic change, something that was not in the company's DNA, shall we say. For example, the Pennsylvania Railroad was one of many railroads that was hesitant to bring in diesel power to replace its steam locomotives. While the Pennsylvania Railroad would actually acquire its first diesel locomotive back in 1937 before World War II, it would take the company in excess of 22 years for it to have a major amount of its fleet covered by diesel engines. The majority would remain steam until that point. The main factor in the reluctance for the Pennsylvania Railroad to adopt diesel technology to its locomotive roster may have been the fact that the company's territory ran through an abundance of anthracite mines, which produced an abundance, of course, of anthracite coal, which was far cleaner burning, and therefore had a tendency to pollute less, as well as much more powerful and efficient per burn, meaning you got more energy out of burning anthracite coal than you would with the far more common bituminous coal. While this might make sense at first glance, the fact of the matter is there is more to it. As I have mentioned in several of my previous videos, it wasn't just the massive inefficiency of these massive beasts that doomed them. It was also the massive amount of maintenance that a steam locomotive required to keep it running that made them less than practical, let alone profitable for this era. Massive back shops as well as roundhouses of backup locomotives had to be kept maintained and in running order, especially for a railroad company the size of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was still at this point in time in American history the largest U.S. railroad in existence. While the ever slow to accept reality, Pennsylvania Railroad had finally grasped it needed to dieselize its operations and eventually make this happen. This took far too long and cost the company far too much money and losses. And the change from steam to diesel locomotives wasn't the only change the Pennsylvania Railroad was aggressively resisting. It seemed basically resistant to almost any change going on in the industry at that time, even if it meant the difference between profitability and loss for the company. A good example of this is the Pennsylvania Railroad's massive 4-track main line, 2 tracks going in either direction, often known and otherwise referred to as the Broad Way. This essentially was the company's calling card, so there might be some logic in why it would be hesitant to give this up. However, there were a lot of massive inefficiencies in using a main line like this. We have to remember that this sport track main line was not done with a modern signaling system, rather a more archaic block system, which required trains to be far spaced apart for it to work effectively, not to mention safely. While the block system may have been considered revolutionary in the late 1800s and well into the 1900s, however, by this point, somewhere in the late 50s to early 60s, it was beginning to look more and more like an old slide rule as opposed to a calculator. New technologies, even at these earlier dates, such as CTC, were coming into existence, which would allow a main line to be double-tracked, but still support the same amount of trains, but using half the tracks, thus saving a railroad company that employed CTC a lot of money in the process, especially in terms of maintenance. Now, one would think, given the company's ever-worsening financial position, that technology such as this would be no-brainers, especially CTC with its potential to reduce overhead drastically on the Pennsylvania Railroad's main line. Unfortunately, this was not the case for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Upper management at the Pennsylvania Railroad would rule this an unnecessary expense, as it continued to cling to the bizarre logic that somehow or other a massive expansion of traffic was coming just around the corner, allowing the company to take full advantage of its sport track main line, and thus declaring this new project that could drastically reduce the overhead of the company nothing more than an unnecessary expenditure, as the company would be caught flat-footed when this massive expansion of traffic, which was just around the corner, mind you, would magically take place. Now, in addition to dieselization, there were still a few more exceptions the Pennsylvania Railroad would undertake, such as in part computerizing its operations. However, the computer systems the Pennsylvania Railroad would acquire really were archaic even for the time, and this would play a pivotal role during the upcoming merger into the Penn Central. One would probably be curious as to who was in charge of the Pennsylvania Railroad and allowing all of this nonsense to go on during this period in time. Truth be told, the company would have several leaders during this period in time, lasting a year or two apiece, till the company board, who were at least in part responsible for the bizarre decisions the Pennsylvania Railroad was making at that time, found Stuart T. Sanders. In many ways, he was pretty much the worst person for this particular job. He had been chairman of a very prosperous company called the Norfolk and Western Railroad, and had seen it expand its territory as well as its efficiency and profitability during his time there. One might think that this would make him the perfect choice to run the Pennsylvania Railroad, but actually this couldn't have been further from the truth. The fact of the matter was Stuart T. Sanders had no experience dealing with a company that was in such financial peril, and he shared the same opinions of the board that was electing him, essentially that the company didn't need drastic changes, just some modifications here and there, as well as avoiding unnecessary expenditures such as those mentioned before, and that would be back to its health in no time flat. In short, if the Pennsylvania Railroad was the Titanic, then Stuart T. Sanders was Captain Smith. On the other end of the equation was the New York Central Railroad, who had been just as resistant to change as the Pennsylvania had been in the past. However, unlike the Pennsylvania Railroad, the company's then chairman, Robert R. Young, began to realize the company needed to make drastic changes if it was going to survive in this new era, where passenger traffic was dropping off, expenses were rising rapidly, and freight was becoming the new way to make money, if not only way. Mr. Young, or Railroad Young as he was known due to his initials, only managed to win the control of the New York Central after a long struggle, which finally ended in 1954, pledging to turn it around. Mr. Young had a very impressive resume at that point, which dated back to his time with General Motors, as well as film, as well as working as the chairman for a number of years of the Chesapeake and Ohio, in which he modernized that railroad by installing computer systems and updating its rolling stock. Unfortunately, not long after assuming the chairmanship, Mr. Young began to quickly discover the enormity of the job he had taken on, as the financial situation of the New York Central was even worse than he had been led to believe. Young had smartly enough realized he needed to make drastic changes to make this company profitable, let alone survivable, in this new era. To assist him in turning the very financially troubled at that time New York Central around, Mr. Young would hire a new executive by the name of Alfred E. Perlman to assist him in this task. Perlman and Young were both considered perfect matches for each other in terms of the way they ran the company, as they both shared the same vision for the modernization of the New York Central. For example, getting rid of as much of its old four-track mainline similar to what the Pennsy had at that time, and replacing much of it as possible with a dual-track CTC-signaled mainline, as well as high-tech innovations such as computerized marshalling yards containing the latest electronics, allowing trains to be quickly dispatched in and out of major hubs with far less labor intensity, thanks to the modern computer systems which would actually do the job more efficient than human beings would be able to. The end result of these and other such modern innovations got the New York Central on the path to profitability, and it actually had paid off quite a bit of its massive debts by the time the Penn Central merger was about to take place. Tragically enough, Mr. Young did not live to see this, having committed suicide in 1958, unable to bear the massive responsibility of getting the New York Central profitable again, which was of course much more massive than he thought when he took the chairmanship, and unfortunately unable to keep certain key promises, such as not suspending the New York Central's dividend, which he was forced to do due to the extreme financial situation the railroad was in at that time. Perlman, however, would assume the chairmanship after his death and put the company back on the right track, if you will. Okay, I promise I'll stick to my day job. What caused these two giant companies to come together in what would eventually be the ill-fated Penn Central merger had to do with the oversaturation of these railroads. There were simply too many railroads paralleling the same territory in the East to make profits. Both the Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central had sought merger partners as early as the mid-50s, but struggled to find partners worth taking and or merging with. It became very clear very early on, unfortunately, that the only merger partner was that of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central's chief rival. They would have the cash on hand to make the merger go through smoothly. While merger talks again would start as early as the mid-50s, a new player would come into place that would play a pivotal role in this disastrous merger called the ICC. And please listen for this name, as it will come up several times in this documentary. The ICC, or Interstate Commerce Commission, was a rather infamous commission set up to regulate the railroads in the United States. By this point in American history, it was becoming a very infamous organization indeed, with the way it continued to regulate railroads from an outdated perspective, with its members, who were in fact assigned by the president to the ICC, more interested in playing politics, or in some cases not knowing what they were doing, as many didn't even understand the basics in how railroads made money or functioned. In short, this organization was at this point more or less there to seemingly give railroads a hard time by, for example, blocking mergers and or making them almost impossible to take place, and otherwise derail any plans railroads may have had at that time. Okay, I'll stop. I promise that's the last one. The idea was to merge the two companies together into one lean, mean fighting machine and essentially make something profitable out of what was basically incapable of being profitable at that time. The combined company, which again was to be known as the Penn Central, would accomplish this by eliminating duplicate trackage, as well as a drastic reduction in staff for the combined company. While on paper this merger seemed to have at least some promise, there were a lot of issues. To start with, this was not the first time a merger of this exact type was attempted in the United States, with two companies again that shared common territory, planning to basically take those tracks and integrate them into one lean, mean fighting machine. The results of that said merger were undesirable, to put it mildly. The Erie and Lackawanna railroads had merged not long before this, and had run into a situation which was loaded with contention, with both sides fighting against each other, as this merger was the same style, both the Erie and Lackawanna railroads sharing essentially the same territory, and both railroads having completely incompatible cultures, with the Penn being resistant to doing things the modern way and cost-cutting, which had led it to be in a more financially precarious situation than the New York Central was at the time of the merger, while in sharp contrast the New York Central was willing to do all of the above, and had actually proven that this was the way forward, as it again had a much more advantageous financial situation when the merger took place. Speaking of the merger, one of the main stumbling blocks was as to which side of the company would have control. This should have all rights had been the New York Central Railroad, as it had proven by this point that it was capable of turning itself, and therefore would be very capable of turning the Pennsylvania Railroad around, through its unique blend of modern railroad practices and cost-cutting, if it were to stick to its cost-cutting policies under Alfred E. Perlman. Unfortunately, this was not to be the case, as after some, and I quote, urging from the Pennsylvania chairman at the time against Stuart C. Sanders, it was decided by the ICC that the Pennsylvania Railroad should have majority and or controlling shares over the combined Penn Central. Another massive stumbling block that threatened to derail the merger, if you will, can't resist that one, was a rather outrageous demand by the ICC that the combined company would have to take over the bankrupt and hopelessly indebted and having no chance to ever make a profit again New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, aka the New Haven Railroad. This company had been turned into a hopeless financial disaster thanks to the lack of foresight and vulture-like tendencies of one of its former chairmen, Mr. McGinnis, who presided over an era in which the company's assets were being sold off, track maintenance was cut back to the point where freight traffic essentially ceased, and the company was reduced to simply being a commuter railroad and nothing more. As I mentioned in my video, The Rise and Fall and Rebirth of U.S. Commuter Railroads, commuter lines are mainly dropped anchors for railroads as they tend to not even so much as break even with expenses, let alone turn a profit. Feel free to check that video out for a little bit more background on what was going on with commuter railroads of this era in the late 60s, early 70s in the United States. Despite the outrageousness of these terms, they were nonetheless agreed to, and the company was merged together in 1968 as the Penn Central Railroad. Needless to say, and unfortunately and outrageously so, it didn't take very long for things to start going noticeably south for this northern company. Okay, I'm sorry, I couldn't resist it, I'm sorry. Mainly because despite all the time that this merger had been planned, in excess of 10 years, and all the warning signs accordingly to try to make this merger as smooth as possible, pretty much a lot of the preliminary work that should have been taken care of wasn't handled. For example, both the New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroad still had completely incompatible computer systems, making it nearly impossible to ship something across one of the two networks. As reducing the staff to make the company one lean, mean fighting machine, this never happened. In fact, both staffs were kept largely intact from both the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central, one being the green team and one being the red team. This unfortunately did not do anything to reduce expenses, worse still, it created animosity between the two halves of the company, with the competition now being brought inside, with both sides refusing to work together or worse still, actively sabotaging each other. The same could unfortunately be said about all the duplicate trackage that was supposed to be reduced because of this merger. None of that ever happened, with very few exceptions. And thus, it was a bloated mess before we even get to the biggest problems this merger had. As mentioned before, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central's corporate cultures were completely incompatible. The New York Central again had recognized the folly of running the old-school methods such as the massive four-track main line which the Pennsylvania Railroad still existed upon, and other such outdated railroading practices which were in fact causing the Pennsylvania Railroad to continue to incur debt and were now threatening to take the combined company down. And what about Alfred Perlman, you ask? Unfortunately, the architect of the New York Central success, Perlman, was put into a largely neutered position, being placed in the position of President, Director, and Chief Administrative Officer of Penn Central Transportation. While this position seemed to indicate that Perlman had a lot of control, this was not the case at all. Largely, Perlman was confined to a window seat. He could look out on what was happening, but could make few changes, and had little to no influence on changes or anything else for that matter. On several occasions, for example, Alfred Perlman would try to get Stewart Standards to agree to projects and or expenditures that would save the company a lot of money in the long run and bring it back onto good financial footing, such as, for example, installing computerized marshalling yards or getting rid of the infamous four-track Pennsy main line and replacing it with double-track CTC, something that would eventually happen several years later. Sanders, however, who was stuck in his protective bubble and the bizarre belief that the Penn Central simply was too big to fail, all this reinforced by his success on the Norfolk and Western, would not go along with this, and his logic being that these were unnecessary expenses and the company needed to further reduce expenses by simply cutting back on things such as this. In doing so, despite the lack of logic to support this bizarre plan, would somehow bring the company back to profitability all on its own. Alfred E. Perlman and Stewart T. Sanders would continue to be at each other's throats essentially for the next 2 years, until Perlman was dismissed on June 8th of 1970. Essentially, Sanders, having had enough of him, finally pushed him out the door. He was going to run the company his own way, the right way, whatever that way was. This protective bubble / unique management style caused him to have a unique way of dealing with employee relations which weren't great at this time. Inflation during this period began to rise drastically, and so to help their members, the unions at the time began to demand higher wages to compensate, with the alternative being, of course, a strike. Stewart Sanders, not used to being in a situation like this and always having enough money to essentially bail himself out, simply gave in to the union's demands and gave them whatever they wanted. This would cause an adverse effect on the financial position of not just the Pennsylvania Railroad, but other railroads in the area, as workers who were members of the same union began to demand the same things from those particular railroads. And then there was yet another headache. The ICC at this period in time, and pretty much the worst time it could, continued to get ever more aggressive in terms of jacking up regulations on railroads, such as pay rates, as well as having almost complete and total control over the rates railroads could charge. Politics would also play a huge role in the way these rates were decided at the ICC. For example, rates would be forced up because expenses had increased, especially now during the 1970s, with inflation jumping up. The political lackeys/appointees that were involved with running the ICC, however, 9 out of 10 times couldn't grasp this and would demand the rates be kept as they were, or worse still, cut. And if the railroads couldn't afford them, well, that was just tough. They had no way of appealing, with very few exceptions, and were essentially largely stuck with the rate the ICC had come up with, despite the fact that the ICC usually didn't understand the situation the railroads were in at the time, or the basic concepts of the need to increase prices when inflation also increased. At the same time, in a situation in which a railroad would be able to provide a cheaper service than, say, a competing trucking company, said railroad would 9 out of 10 times be disallowed from doing so to prevent unfair competition, or at least this was the justification utilized by the ICC at that time. While politics at least in part played a role in these particular decisions, the most outrageous and very much politically motivated decision came from the ICC's reluctance to allow railroads to stop operating branch lines even if they were driving the railroads into debt, and or there was almost no traffic on said line. One might wonder why the ICC was so aggressive with these crazy decisions it was making, and how the politics of this situation played into it at all. Well, example, if you have political aspirations and or want to develop a legacy for yourself, do you want to be known as the person who, for example, in the case of the New Haven Railroad, was in fact at least in part responsible for shutting that railroad down, making commuting to the New York City area impossible for New Englanders, especially if one wanted to run for a political position in that region? And the answer to this, of course, is, well, of course not. So what you do instead, because you're so concerned about making sure the company you're merging together is actually going to be successful, you make the takeover of said railroad a major condition for getting said merger through, with no regard for the fact that you're probably going to destroy the Northeast Railroad system in the process. And well, there, you've got your merger taken care of. You don't have to worry about the company going kaput, and if it does go bust, well, you can just blame someone else. The same sort of idiocy was employed on railroad lines, for example, that needed to be abandoned as they were acting as dropped anchors, threatening to take the companies that owned them down along with them. No one in the ICC wanted to be known for actually causing jobs to be lost, and so therefore the companies were simply forced to run these branch and commuter lines, etc., at a deficit. Again, regardless if this would actually take the companies down by the head in the long run or would cause them more financial harm. The end result of this continued idiocy was as follows. The first year of the merger, 1968, the company found itself in debt to the tune of $2.8 million. Then, in 1969, by the second year of the merger, this ballooned to $83 million. And finally, by 1970, the debt had ballooned all the way up to $325.8 million, forcing the Penn Central to declare bankruptcy, among other reasons, that year. Now, while these numbers may not seem so bad at first here, we have to remember this is before we account for the current inflation rates and what that would be in today's dollars, and the fact that the Pennsylvania Railroad was pretty much cooking the books. This is to say, in this case, shifting debt onto its other divisions, such as its trucking division and its real estate division, which at the time owned Six Flags over Texas, which would eventually become the Six Flags amusement park chain. By this time, the company was a complete and total financial wreck. Track conditions were beyond terrible, so atrocious in fact that trains were derailing in freight yards, let alone on the main line, damaging and destroying cargo in transit to shippers, causing more and more shippers to walk away from using the railroad as a transportation method. Employee morale, despite all the attempts for Sanders and upper management to appease them, remained rock bottom. In fact, due to all the appeasement tactics being employed by Sanders to keep everyone happy, which emboldened the unions to threaten to strike so often in order to get as much in the way of benefits for their members as absolutely possible, as well as seemingly giving the unions more control over the railroad than even Sanders did at that time. Employees were now comfortable just putting any old shipment on any old train and simply hoping it would get to its destination. After all, even if they made such blatant and outrageous and deliberate mistakes, they would get paid anyway and would suffer no consequences. The financial situation had spiraled so far out of control in the Penn Central by this point that even the grants and or loans the company managed to secure from the government basically went to maintaining the status quo, and none of the improvements it promised to make with this money were able to be done, as the labor rates for track laying crews, etc. had ballooned to the point where this simply wasn't affordable in any way, shape, or form. All the cash did essentially was prevent the company from going over the falls for a little bit longer. The ever-worsening and extreme financial situation on the Penn Central Railroad forced it to make ever-extreme decisions. For example, the Pennsylvania Railroad had been forced to demolish Penn Station in New York to turn it into an office complex, as well as the famous Madison Square Garden Sports Complex, in order to get some revenue into its real estate company to help it stay afloat, plus further investments in real estate to help the company manage the debt it was incurring from the massive railroad company, which incidentally no one was seemingly trying to reduce at this point, possibly because the situation had gotten so out of control and so hopeless that pretty much everyone in upper management had given up. And this is essentially the case for the court that had been appointed to reorganize the Penn Central Railroad so it could somehow come out of debt and resemble something resembling a railway. After 2 years of working on this project, the appointed court came back with the conclusion that based upon the massive deficits the company had, plus its ever-falling revenue, that the Penn Central Railroad was simply not reorganizable. Then a very much unwanted 2 in a 1-2 punch came later on in the form of Hurricane Agnes, which destroyed part of the area Lackawanna, forcing it into bankruptcy at the same time. This essentially set off a mid-70s railroad panic in the eastern United States as well as the western United States, as even the western railroads would be in big trouble if they couldn't ship their goods across the East Coast, as there were now few if any connections left. As for how to save the mess, there were a few proposals. One was made to the Seaboard Coastline, which was still very prosperous at this time, who was soon to complete several smaller acquisitions and mergers and be known as CSX, to essentially take over the Penn Central mess, plus the newly bankrupt tracks of the Central New Jersey Railroad and the Erie Lackawanna and other such railroads that had fallen into what would eventually become Conrail, without the debt, and essentially manage the company itself. While this almost came to fruition, the Seaboard, who came close to actually going through with this deal, suddenly backed off when it realized what it was inheriting. The Southeast-based United States Railroad took issue with the ever more militant unions of the Northeast, which were made ever more militant, at least in part, by the Penn Central Railroad's lack of management and or extreme mismanagement of its company, plus the militant reputation that East Coast railway workers had at that time, and plus, once again, the fact that so many East Coast railway companies had suddenly declared bankruptcy in most recent times all at once, made the idea of the Seaboard Coastline pursuing this deal not a smart move for the company to make at that time. There were also talks of nationalizing the railroads in the Northeast, essentially turning them into government-owned entities, but this plan was dropped due to the fact that the Cold War was still going on at that time, and there were fears that if this was to allow to happen, then what would be next to be nationalized under the United States, and would this indeed lead the country down the path of communism eventually? In the end, Congress solved the problem by creating a publicly funded private company called Conrail, which began operations in 1976. Conrail was initially very much disastrous, with a net loss at one point of $1 million per day. Finally, years later, in 1983, with the introduction of deregulatory actions such as the Snaggers Act and the essential abolishment of the ICC, Conrail finally turned its first profit. The company began to steadily increase its profits, starting at $2 million and working its way up to over $300 million per year within a few years. And my opinion, the life and death as well as the merger of the Penn Central Railroad should be taught in all business schools / colleges as how not to do a merger to prevent such a massive disaster from happening again. And while Conrail did right the ship, eventually it would take a lot of taxpayer dollars as well as deregulation to come to pass. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please like and subscribe. And as always, keep the metal side down.